Again, welcome. Just to start off, both of you obviously have an interest in the 90s. Joshua, you looked in your book at pop music and its subgenres in relation to larger political and economic developments. You, Juliana, you looked, among other things, at poets who were using a different language than English, like you yourself did in Fuck You Hello I Love You. You used Hawaiian and Pidgin. Just to start off, where does this interest, particular interest for the 90s, come from?
I mean, I think it's just purely what it means to be of the age that we are. There's nothing other than that. I was kind of like came to consciousness as someone who was trying to write about things in the 90s in some sense. And so it's an attempt to kind of understand what that meant. I mean, there were also these large scale economic changes and big things that were happening at the same time. But I think the particular interest in them is just that, like, narcissistic self-reflection or something, trying to understand something.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me a mix between the very personal and the very sort of incredibly impersonal. I was in school, and the music book in 1989, I was in school then and just spent all day watching MTV and not thinking about it. And years later I was like, I should think about that. I gave a lot of time to it, so I should try and have an idea. But, at the same time, I'd been, as we all do, developing my sense of the political world from a fairly young age, but I hadn't really been able to think globally that, I knew the world existed abstractly, but my politics were very local in their conception. And then with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989, around that time, somehow the structure of global geopolitics seemed much closer to matter in more intense ways in the sudden vanishing of this sort of tragic parody of communism. And that led me to sort of want to be able to think at a more systematic level than I had before, and that was a useful go or something.
Okay. And Juliana, in an article you wrote on the 90s, you distinguish, as Çağlar mentioned, a large number of disparate poetries in English that all use other languages as well than the standard English. And you call it an aesthetics used by many different writers from many different schools, backgrounds. And you call it the 90s style. An aesthetics that prior to these years had been used more to talk about personal identity. But now you say for these 90s style, it was more about language itself and its ties to imperialism. Can you explain a bit more? Well, you said at some point that it might be something to look back as or to feel optimistic about, this 90s style. This use of different languages by so many writers. Could you expand a little bit on that? Why that might be something?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at kind of what happens to literature during that period of time in the 90s in the United States, there are, I mean, a number of things happen because no one thing ever happens in that's kind of literary scene that large, basically. But one thing that happens is the rise of a novel that's in standard English that is often written by someone who is, it's often called in the United States the international novel. It's often written by someone who English might not have been their first language, who writes a novel that is realist and enters into kind of American literature as a kind of exemplary of about another culture. So a novel about China written in English in the U.S. form of the standard English realism. And then there was these kind of moments, and so I was kind of interested in that, why is that happening? And then these moments where it seems like these writers are trying to kind of resist that, the kind of like the way that suddenly
Yeah.
global literary, a lot of global literary production is newly in English in some way, and I felt slightly optimistic about that, but I was also kind of interested in why does it not seem to go anywhere in some way, which is the other question that I was trying to understand, is like, why was that literature not, for instance, hooked into like the anti-globalization movement, which was really taking off in the 1990s? Why is there not a literature of the anti-globalization movement, which I think there's a lot of puppets maybe, and like other forms of cultural production that happened, and didn't seem to be much literature, was not really interested in literature in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's the moment where I try to go back and trace like these kind of like forces that have like really been a sort of like limitation on those ties.
Yeah, but you there was a moment that you did think back in the 90s that the use of other languages might become a tradition, might become, well, maybe even normal or standard.
Maybe, I think it was a way, I mean, it's a way that writers are trying to think themselves out of a kind of literary nationalism,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
they're trying to, like, as writers often do, they're trying to insist on their autonomy.
Yeah.
I mean, whether that autonomy is meaningful or not is kind of like, feels like a more important question.
Yeah. Is that something? Sorry. Is that something that is lost? Is that a lost potential of that decade? Because
yeah.
I mean, it seems like one of the problems that arises when you try and think your way out of a nationalism by a counter-nationalism rather than an anti-nationalism. It seems like that was the fate of some of those trajectories, was just to adopt a different kind of nationalism, and that's not going to sort of it'll generate some energy and some sparks, but it won't generate much sort of development.
Right. Yeah.
Juliana, how do you actually look back at your usage of Hawaiian and Pidgin? Because I think you expressed some skepticism about it.
And the thing that I have that's interesting to me about it now is that it seems very weird, which is in part because I don't live in Hawaii anymore. Although at the time when I lived in Hawaii, it felt like completely normal to do it. But now I feel very strange. It feels very strange to me that I did it. But I mean, I think that just has to do with like I'm not around Pidgin speakers at all anymore, or even around people speaking Hawaiian. Which is like when I was in Hawaii, you would turn on the radio and there would be many songs sung in Hawaiian. So I don't know that I was skeptical of it. It just seems like a weird affectation that I went through in some way.
Question for Joshua. In your book, just to go back to pop music a bit, in your book you claim that pop music is in a way fundamentally ahistorical, as it offers an experience that cancels time, or the experience of time, for 3 or 4 minutes obviously. But you also say that the 90s is the era in which pop music finds its historical moment, or as you put it, it makes sense of its own sensibility. Could you expound on those 2 claims and maybe say how they relate to one another?
It's very generous to to not say I've caught you in a contradiction. So. But as a trained Marxist, I know that every time someone says that to you, you just go it's dialectical, and it solves all problems.
The story's way.
But of course, that will be my answer, right? Which is to say, on the one hand, nothing is really, and every time someone says the word really, all you can do is flinch. But nothing is really ahistorical. I deeply believe that everything is conditioned by and includes a tiny account of, a distorted version of its moment. I really think that. But of those things which in the category everything, only some things aspire to be ahistorical, right? And that's the thing about pop music. I don't think it actually is ahistorical. I think that's its dream, right? Its dream is the intensities of sort of affective charge that make the sense of duration and cause and effect and orderliness and dailiness and the quotidian sort of vanish for a while. And it's amazing, right? And you know, people will hear a song on the radio and someone will say like, oh, that song is timeless. And like, what do they mean when they say that? One thing we know they don't mean is that it will sound timeless in 20 years, because it won't, right? So it's something else. And so I mean, pop music has always dreamed of sort of overcoming the clock in various ways, or overcoming the calendar maybe more effectively. Especially the calendar that measures like, oh, I went to work at 8 o'clock and I came home at 6 o'clock and went to bed, and then I went, like, and to overcome that is a very powerful urge. And that aligned, and right, the moment of the 90s when we seem to be post-historical. There's a famous book about the end of history, and history, you know, in that claim is the ongoing drive toward the best possible, never perfect, but the best possible liberal capitalist state that has the greatest good for the greatest number. And we seem to have arrived there with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And so if history was just the endless struggle to get to an entire planet that was nothing but fairly compliant liberal capitalist states, we did seem to have gotten there. And so there's this fantasy that after the great historical conflict of the 20th century between communism and capitalism, and then the seeming waning of the struggle, of the decolonial struggle, which is the other great struggle of the 20th century, like there was just not that much left to do, right? That was I mean, that's the fantasy, not of us in this room, but of, like, you know, conservative philosophers, which is to say philosophers, and senators, right? They're all, the philosophers and presidents were on the same page. Like, our work here is done, it's management. And pop music, so pop music had always had, like, pop music had this dream for a long time, and finally the dream came true. Like, oh, we've overcome the calendar. And so they sort of align in that moment. But then, of course, the argument I try to make is that those songs do exactly have a yearning for, in their very absence, for sort of the kinds of struggles or antagonisms that had made us feel like we were located in history. And they sort of hold on to that in those weird negative ways.
Are you still a fan today of pop music? I saw the title of your last contribution to The Nation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should publish yesterday or something.
Yeah.
But I ran out of free articles for The Nation, so I couldn't.
Yeah, actually I made like the most naive defense of pop music.
Okay.
So I'm going to tell you, do you have like $9.95? No. No, and actually I just noticed this very minor thing, which is both minor and obvious, but which as far as I know no one had noticed before, which was that television and pop music, which have more or less the same history, a mature history, right? Television, in the way we would recognize it with shows you can watch that are half hour, an hour long, comes into being in the 1950s, at the same time as modern pop music. They have the exact same history, a very similar audience, and one fundamental difference. Television loves the police. Like endless shows that see the world from the police point of view, where the happy ending is when the criminal gets caught. There's a couple exceptions, but basically it's like 70 years of loving the cops. And pop music hates the cops, right? It starts with I Fought the Law in 1958, and it never changes. And in some sense, this is a hoax, right? They're both the same money-making scheme. They're both a plan to get money out of your pocket, but somehow the fact that one of them is willing to just spend 70 years saying the cops are terrible, fuck the police, right? Which is like 70% of hip-hop. I appreciate that. That makes me happy. Yeah, I still love pop music in many ways. My specific taste within it have probably changed somewhat over the years, but there's many things about it that make me happy.
Yeah. But in your talk, you related teen pop to and its falling down in sales to the tech bubble burst. And you use it also as an argument to say that the 90s was really an economic period. But if you look at, you already mentioned it, Juliana, at the the Seattle uprisings, at the World Trade Organization mobilization. There was a different agenda put on the table, a call for a different economic agenda, for an ecological agenda. So I would say it's not just an economic period, but there was talk about the necessity of looking at our economy, looking at our way of living. It was not just all happiness and philosophers and presidents agreeing on the work was done. I do have the feeling that momentum of the Seattle demonstrations were maybe lost due to 9/11 and but more what followed the war on terror and the heightened shock doctrine. So maybe it's not just an economic.
I think you just talked me into believing it was just an economic phenomenon. I mean, if what they wanted was a change in the economy, then that's a. But no, of course, there's no such thing as just economic. I mean, this is why we have the category of political economy, right? Is that it's the artificial division of economics and politics that's the bourgeois fantasy, right? Of like, you can argue politics all you want, you can vote year after year. What you can't argue is that you have to work for someone else to get enough money to stay alive, right? That's not arguable. That's not. So that separation of economic and the political is not mine. That's the bourgeois fantasy.
Yeah.
For me, they're always going to be unified, and struggles look more political in the sense of wanting new representation, or look more economic, and in fact we're pushed exactly by that separation to demand political changes that are not economic changes, and that thus turn out to be temporary. I think Egypt is the worst version of this, right? Where the idea that a revolution is simply that people want the leader to fall, right? Which was the slogan, and they got that. They got that twice, and what happened, right? So it's as soon as you accept the division that I think interesting troubles arise. But the one thing I would say about the economic is that so I was very sympathetic to the politics around Seattle and the ultra-globalization movement, and took part in it in various ways. But it was in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, a sort of protest politics.
Yeah.
And historically, protest politics only work when the nation is very wealthy. And when the nation is wealthy, if there's a lot of protests in the streets, and it will essentially buy peace, right? It will say, like, here's some. This is Juliana was talking about this in her talk about what the Ford Foundation does when there's a lot of, like, you try and spend a lot of money to calm things down. And it can be effective in those situations. So the civil rights movement in the United States, which happens during the biggest economic expansion in history, wins many concessions quite effectively. But when nations are much poorer, and the United States is much poorer now than it was in 1965, those kind of protest politics don't work. So if you think about Juliana's book, This Connection of Everyone with Lungs, one of the things it gives an account of is how in advance of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, we saw the largest street demonstrations in the history of history, the largest across the planet. She provides numbers among other things, and they're utterly ineffective, right? They have zero impact. So the question of what kind of politics can work in what kind of economic situation is one of the ways they go together, right?
But Juliana, I think on the 90s models of resistance, like these Seattle demos and protest movement, I think you wrote that you found it in itself an interesting experiment, for it managed to collect or represent so various goals or things to achieve. So it wasn't a single identity protest movement or a single issue protest movement, but
yeah, I mean that was I mean, one of the complaints that people were saying about that Seattle moment is that it was too, you know, it was why are the nursing mothers there, and why are the turtles there, and people in the turtle suits, right? It should only be this, but I mean, all of that was put together under a protest against globalization.
Yeah.
At the same time, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was very, I mean, Occupy had that too, where it had like, you know, like it was a mass movement, and then it had incredibly variable politics.
Yeah.
Like, who was that guy, Ron Paul, that everyone, there's like all these like weirdos, like these Ron Paul weirdos that get up all the time and talk about the gold or some stuff like that.
Yeah, or the gold, or that the real problem with the United States is that we were no longer honoring the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and we needed to like get back to a firmer, stricter reverence for those, and that would, I mean, I literally watched those guys recite the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution to police officers. As like, I will show you, sir.
I mean, just mass movements, just like they just had that. Like that's everyone comes and they come with their, you know, it's a bunch of freaks.
But still, regarding your talk, where you talk about this mainly white room, and we still need to address gender, we still need to address race, and still need to pursue this diversity. It would be interesting to have models of resistance, or to think about not only representation but also how we could pursue this emancipation without returning back to identity politics, or yeah.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, it would be interesting. It's hard for me to imagine. I mean, the U.S. just has a different level. You know, it just deals with these issues very differently, for various historical reasons. It's difficult for me to imagine that moment.
Yeah.
Like I really can't imagine something in the U.S. in which like identity is such a large part of both political discussion, literary discussion, music discussion in some form.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to.
Well, it's a very important debate in the Netherlands as well. We have most of the time a mostly white room in literary production, in readings, and
I think we need to wrap it up, she said. But
We're just getting started.
Yeah, that's true. I have 3 more pages. Alright, maybe we should just ease smoothly to your poetry, perhaps, because you're going to read for us in a bit. So I'll do that smoothly.
It's already incredibly smooth.
Is it? I was just, we talked about movements, and obviously one in which you have been active has been Occupy, the Oakland version of it. Just maybe to give us a sense of the specific historical moment from which your latest collections of poetry spring from. Red Epic, Joshua, and The Winter the Wolf Came, Juliana. Both kind of bear the imprint of political action on the streets, but they also want to make sense of it by looking to larger systems, economic or ecological. Maybe you could just give us kind of a sense of how that Occupy period was for you, the mood, what kind of sensibilities there were for you. I know that you were arrested, Joshua. Maybe that's a smooth way to say it.
Yeah, but pretty much everyone is arrested sooner or later. I mean, I guess I think to give a sense of like the mood or the tenor of the times would be almost impossible. Like for me, like in some ways the book is one of my attempts to do that in various ways. Juliana's doing is an attempt to do it in a quite different way. I think she actually gets at mood much better, because I think I move too swiftly sometimes to wanting to the global system that I was talking about, sort of interested in before, and less a sense of place. We have different interests or approaches in certain ways. It was without a doubt one of the most powerful experiences of my life. I didn't expect it to be. I mean, to be honest, when Occupy Wall Street started, which started first, there was already various political groups in Oakland who'd done organizing together, often around sort of university struggles as austerity was being implemented in the university, and then groups around the riots that had happened after a young African-American kid named Oscar Grant was killed. And we all knew each other, or some of us knew each other. And when Occupy Wall Street sort of got going, we were very skeptical. In part because it was originally called by this magazine that we found kind of trivial and foolish. And so we were like, we're not going to do that. And then within a week, it had blossomed into this huge thing, and they're like, we should do this too. So I want to be honest about that, right? That we had a sort of sideways entrance into it, but having had other experiences of sort of militant politics in the Bay Area before that, for a lot of us, we committed to a fairly militant program in Oakland, which ended up having a very different atmosphere than Occupy Wall Street, which I visited, so we made some very basic rules. One was that we would never bargain or discuss with we were right in front of City Hall, and we would never bargain or discuss with them, which was not true of most places. We got in these long sort of like, you need to move 7 feet that way because of fire code, and we just never did that. We would not let anyone speak if they represented any group. Anyone could speak on their own if they wanted to, but no one could speak on behalf of the Democratic Party or the Socialists or anything. That proved to be incredibly powerful, and we wouldn't allow any cops in the entire square, which sometimes was very confrontational, but really changed the tenor. So all those things made it feel militant and made it feel incredibly powerful. But in a way, the crucial aspect was, but in ways I don't understand, a lot of the organizers were also people who wrote poetry or read poetry. In part, the organizers who came from the university side, but not only. And so poetry was always sort of a big part of it, actually. Not in the sense of everyone loved poetry. There were poetry readings, but in the sense that people who were organizing the camp and doing things were also poets. People who were involved in Occupy Oakland also, who weren't poets, also got very interested in poetry. So there was this period where you'd go to a poetry reading, and most of the people would not be the same group of poets you usually knew from the Bay Area, but would be people from Occupy, right? Anarchists and communists and crazy Ron Paul people, not so much, but and it really changed the entire experience of being a poet, right? Being involved in poetry, when you suddenly see oh, my community is not poetry people, my community is communists or anarchists or something like that. And that was part of the inspiration for the press that we started with our friend Jasper, which was to try and make a press that published poetry, but didn't necessarily think of itself as a poetry press so much as a press with a set of political commitments, anarchist and communist, that would sort of appear in poetry. And so that has really changed my entire relationship to what I do.
Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add around that. That felt like a fairly fair history.
Can I ask one more question, or should we? Okay, let's answer. Thanks so much for answering our questions, and it was very short, it seems.
Yeah.
But we have time for the poetry. Yeah.